All right, welcome to our last lecture on the Middle Ages. So we've covered a lot of material on the Middle Ages. We've gone from the Franks to life in the Middle Ages, feudalism, lords and vassals, and crusades, and all these like church-state conflicts. And it's a dramatic period of history, to say the least. And it is during the Middle Ages, the end of the Middle Ages, that things begin to happen that will end the Middle Ages. And we've kind of touched on a few of these, right? The Crusades, the Hundred Years' War, the Great Schism. But there's one more event that will have a greater impact than any of those in ending the Middle Ages. And to understand this event, we need to look at some numbers. So here we go. So here are some important numbers I need to jot down, and go ahead and get these down. You can see the numbers on the left and the numbers on the right, and you may be able to see where this is going. On the left, you have years, right? 1200, 1250, 1300, 1350, 1400 AD. On the right, you have numbers in millions. And what you're looking at here are population numbers. And what you see as you go through the end of the Middle Ages, the numbers of people go up, 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 up. And then right over here, something happens. And it was in this year, 1347. And again, you don't need to memorize the exact year, but it was in that year half the population, or nearly half the population of Europe dies, Western Europe. And I will say this, you can open up 10 different history books and find 10 different sets of numbers, but it is going to be a consistent thing that, around the mid 1300s, you see a massive population decline. Could have been 30%, 40%. You'll find different sets, but pretty big, maybe as high as 50% even. And again, I always kind of put this in there to give you a little bit of perspective of things. Think of something like COVID in 2020. COVID, if you look at the population of the United States, about 330, 340 million people, and in the year 2020 killed about 200,000 people, right? I think that works out to something like 0.06% of the population, right? So that would be something like COVID. If you take some 0.06 a point, right? If you take something like the Spanish flu, that killed more like 0.6% of the population, or 0.7% of the US population, so much bigger. So the Spanish flu was worse than COVID, and the bubonic plague blows them both out of the water in terms of percentages of people that died in a nation. And if you think of what COVID did, something we can wrap our brains around because most of us live through it now, is not just the deaths, but what it did to the economy, right? When you shut down everything, then the economy collapses for a while. It was remarkable that there was improvement even after that, considering how bad you had to shut everything down. Think of the impact on depression, on anxiety, on all sorts of things, right? Divorces, all these things kind of really had a big impact on people, and that's a number of 0.06%. So now what is something going to do in a society that's not, 0.06%, not 0.6%, not 1%, not 10%, but something like 30% of the population, 40%, maybe 50%. And you can begin to wrap your brains of what kind of things something like the bubonic plague or Black Death can do to society. It's going to be a transforming event in human history, and we're going to see that as we continue on here. All right? So here are all the key words you're going to need to know. This lecture doesn't have a lot of key words, but it's going to have a lot of important ideas and concepts you're going to need to grasp. So go ahead and get them all down. And then I'm going to go to our map here, and I'm going to tell you a few different things. Basically, what I need you to know about the Black Death or bubonic plague are, how the plague arrived, what are the causes. We're going to talk a little bit about the plague itself, and then most importantly, I think, are the impacts of the plague. So the causes, the plague itself, and then the impacts. Very straightforward, but very important lecture we have here. In terms of the causes of the bubonic plague, it is going to start in Italy first, right? Let me go to our map and then make sure, again, if you need a pause, get all these terms down before you move forward, and then we'll go through. You can have them by you as always, as we've done all semester. So here's just our map of Europe. Here's Italy, of course, and the plague will begin in Italy first. Why? Well, Italy has a lot of ports, and the plague arrives because of ships that were carrying grain. these ships that were carrying grain attracted rats. Now, it wasn't the rat that caused the plague. It was actually these fleas that the plague that the rats carried on them. Fleas that, I don't know, may look something like this. It's a close-up of a flea. I just Googled a close-up of a flea, and there it is. But this is what made everybody sick. This is what gave everyone the bubonic plague. So, back to our map, just slightly different map here. The plague arrives to Italy and then spreads. It spreads through all the trade routes that had started at the end of the Middle Ages. Remember one of the impacts of the Crusades I talked about, and now it's really important, is that the Crusades increased trade, first from the East and then also within Western civilization. And these trade routes, which brought a lot of cool things from the Eastern world into the West, also helped spread the plague. And it spreads very quickly. 1347 hits Italy in a couple places. By 1348, 1349, it's in all of Western Europe. And it is more in Western Europe than Eastern Europe. For those of you who take the second half of this course, History 111, again, I hope a lot of you do, I kind of do a little bit of this lecture in that class as well. Not quite as much detail here. I'm going to give you more detail because it impacts the way the monarchies develop later on in history. But for our purposes, just remember it spreads very dramatically in the West. So that's the number one cause, just from the trade. There were other factors that, of course, made the plague so devastating. Another cause of the bubonic plague was the lack of literacy. About the only people who could read and write consistently in the Middle Ages were the church. So if you don't have a lot of literacy, you don't have a lot of medicine, science developing. Science in the Middle Ages was not that good, guys. I mean, if somebody thought you were crazy, they thought they had a spirit in your head. So they would take a drill and drill a hole in your head and pull the drill out because they thought the spirit was making you sick. Well, okay, except the problem with that, and they thought it was working. You know why they thought it was working? Because, if your body is 98.6 degrees and it's 30, 40 degrees outside because you're in Northern Europe or something, and they pull the drill out, if your body is warmer than the temperature outside, you're going to see steam. And they say, oh, the steam's leaving the body. It must, you must be cured from the crazy. It's going to kill you, but you get the idea, right? So basically, long story short, this is not a good way to deal with things. So their medicine wasn't very advanced. So that's a second cause. A third cause is the cities. Remember when I mentioned cities in the Middle Ages and I showed you that image of Siena and how crowded the streets were and how, things were really dirty and all of that. There wasn't any sewage system. So in many ways, it's a bit ironic. The Middle Ages helped create the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague will then end the Middle Ages. So we'll see kind of how that unfolds as the story goes along. So those are what the causes. Now, obviously, I don't even know the medical terminology myself. I'm not sure. I think it's a bacteria, not a virus. But don't hold me to that. But there's this whole medical stuff that they didn't understand. Now they have theories back then of what caused the plague. What kind of theories? Well, they thought comets caused the plague. Why comets? Because they thought the tail of the comets would spew things down that was making everybody ill. Or they thought earthquakes caused the plague because they thought the earthquake would crash, from the underworld. It would be a big, earthquake and it would spew things out from the underworld, making everyone sick. Another horrible theory they had was that people were poisoning the water and there was a group of people making everybody sick on purpose. Who did they blame? Well, the Jews. And in fact, 1348, a year after the plague hits, in the city of Strasbourg, remember that Oath of Strasbourg we lectured on earlier? There was a massacre of thousands of Jews because they said the Jews caused the plague and they were poisoning the water. Of course, it's complete nonsense, but it shows you the mentality of Europe at the time, and unfortunately, even much till today, there's this very strong anti-Semitism that grips much of Europe in Western civilization. So anyway, so Strasbourg is where that happened. So they had all these theories, but they were all nonsense because again, they didn't really get it. So that's essentially how the plague arrives. Now, in terms of the symptoms and the plague itself, let me go through some of these. So let me start with the symptoms. So again, get this down. Like I said, there aren't a lot of key words on this lecture. So just, I didn't write down all the symptoms, but you should jot them down. So usually when you get the plague, the first day or so, you feel a little bit underwhelmed. You feel like a little under the weather. And then you start sneezing a lot. Now, of course, when somebody sneezes today, you say, bless you. That goes back to the plague. Why? And because what's about to happen next, you need to be blessed. And what happens next is you get these boils or blisters. Again, I'm not familiar with all the medical terminology that appear on your bodies, boils, blood boils, blisters. They get to like the size of golf balls sometimes. And then you get a fever, your organs begin to fail, and those blood boils kind of burst and pop and dry and turn your body black. That's where we get the term Black Death. And then you're basically disintegrating from the inside out. It's a nasty way to go. It'll kill you in about a week's time or so sometimes. So it's fast, it kills you, it's brutal, it's apparently painful. And so this is what's spreading all across Europe. So those are the symptoms of the bubonic plague. Interesting, a couple interesting stories about this. Do people get the bubonic plague today? And the answer is yes. Actually, almost every single summer, you will hear a story of someone getting the bubonic plague. Sometimes in other parts of the world, sometimes in the United States. It's not always carried on rats. It's oftentimes carried on things like squirrels. Don't play with the squirrels. Oh, the cute little squirrel. Squirrel's going to kill you. So yeah, don't play with the squirrels and stuff. But definitely it is scary. Now you go, why doesn't everybody die from it if it's still around today? Well, one, unless you're a moron, if you start seeing blood boils appear on your body, you're going to go to the doctor and we can get it treated. But then the other thing is that there are very strong, a lot of science has been done on this, and this is where history and science go nicely together here, is people have studied this, and we've discovered that there were people during the bubonic plague who were, it says here, I don't know if you could see this up on the corner, cities or areas totally spared, and there were regions where nobody died. And then there were other regions where everybody died except for maybe a handful of people. So what we have a possibility of is very simple. The plague kind of ran its course. Remember, today, we look for vaccines for flus and smallpox that we have and polio and all these things. They didn't have that back then. And so it basically runs its course. And it was devastating that at the time, people were not immune to it. Very few people were. And so today, what we believe is we basically have more immunities to it, right? So when we look again something like the COVID event or even the Spanish flu that hit back in 1918, which was worse than COVID, by the way, in terms of per capita damage, by far, right? Actually, the thing is like obviously today a lot of people are immune to COVID. If we were, then we'd have 50% of the population die, or we get it and you have very light symptoms. The bubonic plague, if you got this thing back then, it apparently almost killed a lot of people. There weren't that many people immune to it or had minor symptoms, and that's why it was so devastating. And so this is the thing. And again, it came from the Eastern world. And that's the other thing. Look, whenever you have cultures that interact with each other, this sometimes ends up happening. Again, COVID came from China. The bubonic plague probably came from the Eastern world as well. When the Europeans went to the New World, what did they do? They brought diseases with them through trade that impacted people in the New World. That's just the reality that when you have cultures intermingling with one another, this is more likely to happen. Again, you can't live in a bubble, but either. So it's always this kind of crazy life balance we always try to find. All right. So anyway, so that's kind of an interesting thing. So yes, people can get it today. And there were some people back then who were completely immune to it. So anyways, that's a few things about the symptoms. Then the next thing is, how do they treat it? And so let's talk about some of the treatments. And the treatments, well, they weren't that great. Again, since they didn't know what caused it, they had a bunch of crazy treatments. What kind of ideas did they have for treatments? Well, they thought wearing amulets to ward off evil spirits would cure you from the plague. Didn't work. They thought what was another one? Amulets to ward. They thought if you eat magical herbs, that would cure you from the plague. Didn't work. They thought if a pigeon picked at you, that would cure you from a plague. I don't even know where they came up with that one. That didn't work. They thought if they cut you open, bleed you open, that would cure you from the plague. Well, that didn't work. So they didn't have any really good ideas. There was one interesting idea in Italy. In Italy, and this is going to be another one of those words we still have in our English language today as you're thinking about that contribution essays, one of the things we see in Italy during this time is that they said any ships arriving to Italy, everyone on the ship had to stay on the boat for a quadraginta. It was one of the key words. And if after, what's a quadraginta? Quadraginta is 40 days. If after 40 days no one is sick, they can leave the ship and go to the mainland. Now, what word do we get from that? Quarantine, and that's where we get the word quarantine that, of course, everyone is familiar with. And so, anyways, that's the quadraginta term. It's a good idea, but too little, too late. By then, the plague had already spread. So, anyways, that's the ways they tried to treat it, and it wasn't very effective. All right, so now I want to get to really the most important part of the plague, which is the impacts, right? And there's a lot of impacts on the bubonic plague. And this is a really good one for class discussions and stuff, but I could kind of run through some things with you and then really kind of explain it to you well. So one of the things is psychological impacts, right? How are people going to behave? And people are going to behave irrationally, right? Half the people, are dying. It's going to be pretty big. Maybe it is rational if half the people, are dying. And you're going to get different reactions. Some people are going to be like, live as a hermit. I'm going to live. I'm not going to see anybody. I'm not going to talk to anybody. I'm going to, live in my little bubble and I don't want to see a human being. All right. If half the people around you are dying, okay. All right. Again, look at COVID, and that was 0.0002%, 0.0004% of the population, and look how people oftentimes reacted, right? Very isolationistic. So that was some. Other people were like, eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow we all shall die. And there was that. It was just party on, right? I mean, we're going to die anyways. We want to celebrate. So there was that attitude. That was a psychological impact that some people had. Um, again, if you looked at the COVID period of time, anxiety meds skyrocketed, right? Because people were, had so much anxiety. So there is this psychological impact that is something like this is going to have on people. There's a really good source in your BD book. You actually have an assignment on it called the Decameron. It's part of one of the assignments. Make sure you read it. And he just kind of talks about the plague and what it did. It's an excerpt of it. There's also an old movie, if you're interested in this stuff, called The Seventh Seal. It's really weird. It's this old movie about a guy playing chess with death. And it's just this weird movie. It's all subtitled, I think Swedish, but it kind of has a lot of this stuff. It's kind of this classic film, I guess. I don't know. I always thought it was weird, but people like it. So anyways, so those are just a handful of the psychological impacts. Another impact is, people look for answers. And so for one thing, one of the other kind of psychological impacts on it were a group of people known as the flagellants. Here they are. And what is that? It comes from the Latin word flagellum. And these were people who go around whipping themselves, right? Basically they think this is end of days. God is punishing us. And so, we're being punished. And so they would whip themselves. And so you have that. So that's an impact of the bubonic plague. There is one interesting cultural impact of the bubonic plague as well. What's a good cultural impact of the bubonic plague? Well, when you were kids, you may have heard this before. And I will preface this, it may have not come from the 1347 bubonic plague, what I'm going to tell you next. The bubonic plague does happen other times in history, so this may have been from a more modern version, but you've all heard this before. Ring around the rosies, pocket full of posies, ashes to ashes, we all fall down. All right, well, guys, that's a morbid little song. What are you singing about? Well, ring around the rosies. The blood boils that appear on your body rings around rosies. Pocket full of posies. The smell from all the dead bodies. People would stuff posies, flowers, in these masks of theirs to hide the smell from all the dead bodies. Ashes to ashes, maybe a derivative of a chew, the sneezing sound, or maybe the burning of the bodies. And then we all fall down is we all die, right? That's the whole thing. Ring around the rosies. Very morbid. Actually, a lot of nursery rhymes are very morbid that people don't even realize. Here's another one. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown. Guys, Jack is dead, right? And Jill came tumbling after. She's dead too. You know, and then Rockin' My Baby. Oh my God, why would you sing that to a baby? I don't sing that to my baby. I mean, she's gonna cry at night. Rockin' My Baby on the treetop, and then how does it end? It ends with the tree falling, baby and all. Baby dies. Don't sing that to your baby. So you have that going on there. So anyways, a lot of morbidity, and that's what a lot of these nursery rhymes are about. So anyways, so you got these flagellants, you have all these kind of interesting little impact art. If you look at any art from the Black Death, it's going to be very macabre, very dark. But the most important impact of the Black Death for our purpose is the impact on the political structure. So we're going to spend some time on this next slide here. All right, so this is important. So remember the power structure that we had talked about before. We had talked about this when we started the Middle Ages. And this always kind of is a hard topic for students to grasp. And so I spent time on it. I gave you a discussion board where you can either have a little extra credit explaining this. It's one of your possible essay questions. So I kind of want to go through this in class with you here. In class, my traditional classes, I have students work in groups. I have them kind of sort it out themselves. But I'm just going to kind of go through this with you, and you can kind of think about it. So if you remember in the Middle Ages, we talked about the power, and we said the church had the most power. And then we had the kings, we had nobles, and right, they had some powers, right? And then we had a little power at all. The serfs were there on the bottom. And then we had those merchants somewhere on the side. You should have this from a previous lecture, right? And then the question is, what happens to this power structure of the Middle Ages? What happens to the power of the church? What happens to the power of the kings? What happens to nobility? What happens to the serfs down here with no problem? Does their power go up or does their power go down? And so that's essentially what we're doing with that essay question. It's a question of what happens to each of these groups as a result of the Black Death, but not just the Black Death, the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, the Great Schism, and the Black Death. So this is actually what I would like you to do right now. What I would like you to do is to pause I'll give you instructions and pause the video. I want you to think about these four events. The Great Schism, well, the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, the Great Schism, and the Black Death. Those four events. And I want you to think about how each of those events impacted each of these groups, the church, the kings, the nobility, the serfs, and the merchants. Do you think their power went up or down? So what you should really do is pause the video. You should think about it. You should write down your thoughts, then come back to the video, right? And see if you came up with what I'm about to describe to you. I hope you do that. I hope you pause and that's how you're going to learn. And if you got it wrong, that's okay, right? If you got it right, well then, you know, you're on the right track and you're figuring things out very nicely. All right. So either pause it or you didn't, but here we go. Let me go ahead now and explain to you what I hope you've kind of tried to figure out on your own. So let's start with the power of the church, right? And church, right? And so the power of the church, does it go up or down? Excuse me. And it's going to go down. And it goes down for a few reasons. So it goes down if you think of something like the Great Schism, right? The Great Schism is going to hurt the power of the church because they're split. There's 2, 3 popes at the same time, especially when you consider that the Great Schism is happening in the same time of the bubonic plague. So half of Europe is dying. People go to the church. Hey, church, why is everyone dying? And the church goes, oh, they don't have answers. And not only does the church not have answers, the church is bickering on who should be the pope. So that is going to hurt the power of the church. So if you're writing a paragraph on the Great Schism, somewhere in there you should talk about the church power declining. And so obviously the Great Schism is going to hurt the power of the church. Okay. What about any other groups does the Great Schism impact? Well, the kings. The Great Schism is going to help the power of the kings. Why? Who ended the Great Schism? It was the kings. The kings got involved. The kings were the ones who said, you got to sort this out. Also, who was the biggest challenge to the kings in the Middle Ages? It was the church, right? Remember those church-state conflicts? Well, now that the church is looking so fallible, that opens up the door for kings. So in terms of the Great Schism, you know, in your little discussion of the Great Schism, what you should have in there is something along the line of the church losing power, the kings gaining a little power. That's the thing. What about the Crusades, right? Maybe I should have started with that one first, but it doesn't matter. What about the Crusades? The Crusades, did those impact the church up or down? Well, the Crusades were supposed to take over the Holy Land. Did they succeed? No. Who, that was who organized the church? Who said let's go on the Crusades? The church. So again, maybe not as much as the Great Schism, but that's going to hurt the church power. The Crusades impact anybody else? Well, I'm hoping you have some notes on that because you should have something along the lines of how the Crusades impact the merchants. How do the Crusades impact the merchants? Well, one of the things Crusades did is increase trade. As it increased trade, cities are going to become more important. People living in these cities, the merchants, these guilds, they're going to become more important. Cities are going to get larger, so the cities themselves become more significant as a result of the Crusades. So the Crusades, now again, not each one of these events is going to impact all the groups, right? But so the Crusades impacts primarily the church and, a large degree, the merchants. The Great Schism impacts the church and the kings. Doesn't really impact nobles too much, doesn't really impact merchants too much. What about the 100 Years' War, right? So you should have a bit of information on the 100 Years' War. Well, in the 100 Years' War, right, if you remember that event, that's going to impact a couple of these groups, right? It's not going to really impact the church much, but it will impact kings, nobles, serfs quite dramatically. In terms of nobility, their job in the Middle Ages was to fight. The 100 Years' War, that's gone now, right? Remember what we talked about when we lectured on the 100 Years' War. Their job is not, you're useless now. So you're good. You got a sword. Lovely. I got an army with a bunch of cannons and guns. I win. And so nobles, they lose one of their most significant roles as a result of the 100 Years' War, the new fighting. The role of the lowest classes, these serfs, and we're going to change their names. They're not going to be serfs anymore, and we'll explain why in a second. We'll call them peasants now, and I'll show you why that is in a moment. But they're going to go up because they're going to have a more important role in society. They're going to have, a role of being part of the military. So they're going to have a more significant effect on society. And therefore, the kings, they're way up as a result of the 100 Years' War because the kings no longer have to rely on the nobles. They have their own armies now, and so they're going up again. So now the kings have benefited a couple of ways, right? They've benefited from the Great Schism, and they've benefited from the 100 Years' War. All right, and now we get to the Black Death because the Black Death is the big boy, right? That impacts everybody. Let's go through this. Power of the church, up or down? Well, the Black Death obviously hurts the power of the church. Why? People go to the church for answers. Church can't explain it. That hurts the church. Church figures are dying along with everybody else. That hurts the church. So that's pretty important. The Black Death, let's go all the way to the smallest group, or the least powerful group, the serfs. Black Death is going to end serfdom, right? It's not a matter of the serfs going up or down. It's going to end the concept of serfdom, one of the core characteristics of the Middle Ages. Why? Well, let's think it through. And again, I'm hoping you thought all this through before. And if you didn't, make sure you're getting all these ideas down, right, as we're talking about this. So the power of the serfs, think of what serfs do. Serfs were the ones who worked the fields. That was their job. Black Death hits, half the population of Europe dies, which means that's half the population. The serfs were 90%, right? Remember, this group was 90% of the population. Half of them are dead. What does it mean to the ones that aren't dead, the ones who survive? There's a lot less of them. And this is simple economics 101. If you have less workers, they are now more valuable, right? Think of life today. If you want to make more money, it's not life today, life at any point. If you want to make more money in life, develop a skill that less people have, right? If you have a very low-skilled labor job and you never find a way to go above that, and you're not motivated and you're not, responsible to do more and all of that, well, you're never going to make a lot of money, guys, right? If you start off as a McDonald's, but then, which is a great job to start off with, by the way, and you start working up the chain and you become assistant manager and manager, and then you work hard, and then you start, developing better techniques and ways of doing things. Well, then now you're more valuable, right? If you are somebody who's really good with a technology that few people are, you're more valuable. Well, now half the population of your workers have died. And so that means the workers who survive are more valuable. The idea of forcing someone to tie to the land to work the fields is gone. If I'm a noble and I have land, I have to now pay somebody, peasants, to work my fields. So we're not even going to call them serfs anymore. Now we're going to start calling them peasants. And these peasants are still going to be poor. I don't want you to think that all of a sudden they're very powerful. They're still peasants. And one of the things is you have to keep in mind, guys, we are still centuries away from democracy and enlightenment ideas and people rule. That's nowhere there. But now at least you have peasants. If you want to work the fields, if you want somebody to work the fields, you got to pay them. The idea of I am reliant and dependent on some government institution to take care of me is gone, right? I can make my own way. And so that's important. So that's how the Black Death impacts these lowest groups, the serfs and serfdom, and now you have peasants. All right, nobles. The Black Death's going to impact nobles because, again, the nobles that survive, they lose their labor, so that's going to hurt them. Merchants, as a result of the Black Death, because you have more people are peasants, they're no longer tied to the land. More people are moving around. Where are they going to go? A lot of people are going to cities. Cities are going to get bigger again, and cities are going to become more important. Cities, as we end the Middle Ages and move into the modern world, instead of 30, 40,000 people, are going to be 100,000 people. And so, again, that makes the merchants more important. So they're going to have kind of a little bit of a bigger role. And then the kings, well, the king is still the king, right? The thing is with the Black Death, if you're the king, you are still the king. You're still the man, right? It doesn't matter that even if you die, well, your hair is there. And again, we're centuries away from anyone challenging the king power or authority. So the king kind of benefits in some degree. So as a result of all this, I'm going to erase all this now. I'm going to show you what happens. So this is the next part of your chart here. If you look at the 1500s, roughly, we go from the age of faith, right, when we said the church had the most power, to now the age of kings. And the kings will be the dominant force. In fact, as we move through these years between 1500 and close to 1800s, 1700s, we're going to have some kings are going to become absolute monarchs, right? And the kings are going to be the top figure. Now, you're going to have other people. Church is still going to have some influence. Nobles are still going to have, I'm just reading because it's hard to write with the mouse. Nobles are going to have some influence. Merchants are now going to be there. So the N is for nobles, the M is for merchants. And peasants are going to be there at the very bottom. I know you can't read that. They're going to still be at the very bottom with very little power. So these three groups are going to kind of, be bouncing around here. The peasants are going to be at the bottom. The difference is now there's 70% of the population. Where is that other 20% made up? Probably people living in the cities, the merchants, the city dwellers. That group gets a little larger. So that's what ends up happening. And so that's the understanding. I know it's a lot there to process. If you need to listen to all that again, do so. But you need to really understand all that. And I always say history is not about memorizing dates and names only. It's really about understanding why things happen. And so for the next couple hundred years, we're going to have the Age of Kings. Now in this class, History 110, we don't focus on that much. If you take the second half of this class, we keep going and we explain, how things change in the modern world. Eventually, these kings are going to be knocked down. Who knocks down those kings? Well, it's going to be this group right here. That merchant, 20%. That's where you get into the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Enlightenment. Circa 1800 is right after the American French Revolutions, right? And then again, things continue to change as we move to modern times. All right, so anyways, so that's kind of where we are with the Black Death, obviously pretty dramatic. And then from there, we end up moving to the modern world. So the next lecture will be on the new modern world, and then we'll go from there. All right, hope all that's very clear. If you have any questions on all that, let me know. Thank you.